This is Intelligence Matters, sponsored by FLAIR, a leader in providing actionable cyber threat intelligence to companies and governments around the world.
Andrea Kendall-Taylor is a senior fellow and the director of the Transatlantic Security Program at the Center for New American Security. She is a former CIA analyst and a former deputy national intelligence officer at the National Intelligence Council. She joins us today to give an update on the war in Ukraine. We will be right back with that discussion after a quick break. I'm Andy McCreadis, and this is Intelligence Matters. Here's my colleague, Michael Morell, with a message about FLAIR.
The lines between geopolitical risk and cyber risk are blurring. FLAIR is a next-generation, continuous threat exposure management SaaS platform that equips corporate information security teams with world-class collection and continuous monitoring across dark web cybercrime forums, markets, Telegram channels, and sources of geopolitical risk. FLAIR sets up in 30 minutes, creates actionable intelligence from hour one, and is used by governments, security teams, and threat intelligence teams around the world. You can try FLAIR's free trial at their website, FLAIR.io. That's FLAIR.io.
Welcome back. There's a lot of attention in the news today on the Middle East, and consequently focus has shifted away from the war in Ukraine. We will talk later about what that might mean, but we don't want to lose focus on all the national security challenges facing the U.S. here at Intelligence Matters. So thank you, Andrea, for joining us to talk about the war in Ukraine. I know this is your second time on the podcast. Andrea, let's start with the military situation. How would you broadly characterize it today?
Well, Andy, it looks a lot like a deadlock. And I say that because although the fighting continues and it continues quite intensely, there's been very few changes to the front lines. And it's been that way really for the last several months. And I guess to try to make that a little bit more concrete, I think listeners probably know that Ukraine began its counteroffensive more than 5 months ago. And I think they've managed to take just something like 15 kilometers over that 5-month period. And the same is also true on the other side. The Russians are, more in a defensive posture, but thinking about the big battle for Bakhmut, they fought there for about 10 months to take the teeny tiny town of Bakhmut. So I think overall, it's fair to say, and Ukrainian senior officials would say this as well, is that this counteroffensive has been disappointing. Ukraine has failed to accomplish its objectives in this counteroffensive. What they set out to do was really to cut that land bridge from Russia to Crimea, and they've made very little progress along those lines.
So let's talk about the counteroffensive just for a minute. There was this huge buildup. It's coming, lots of discussion about it. And now it seems to have flopped. Maybe that's too strong, but
that's pretty.
That's
fair.
What you just said. So, what do you think went on there? Did the Ukrainian military misjudge? Was the Russian defense better than they had anticipated? What do you think went into that?
I think it's probably a little of all of what you said. I do think that there were probably false expectations boosted and advanced in the media. But at the end of the day, a lot of this story is about Russian defenses, as you said. And so Russia really had, since the beginning of the war, since the earliest days when they had taken some of this territory in the east and in the south, to build up very well-entrenched defenses. So landmines everywhere. I do think that the Ukrainians found that harder to penetrate than they were initially expecting. So I think it's all of the above, both well-entrenched Russian defenses, some false expectations set out. And really I think part of the story was the difficulty that Ukraine had in fighting the way that we would want their military to fight. So initially they set out to do some of the mechanized assaults using Western equipment, and they took very heavy losses in the earliest days of its counteroffensive. And so they were forced to change tactics to go back and fight in much smaller units, much more to the way that they were accustomed. So I think part of the story too is the story of adaptation on Ukraine's side as well.
So did the pause and the buildup give the Russians time to adapt, or are they still fighting the same kind of battle, just that Ukraine is less effective?
I think the Russians, there has been some adaptation, but in many ways, and you can see this going on in Avdiivka now, where they have increased the rate of their offensive operations in this part of Donetsk, is that in many ways, so yes, they have adapted, but in other ways they haven't. And they continue to fight in Avdiivka and are taking really significant losses there, sending in some of the human waves again. So it's a mixed bag. In that sense, in terms of the way that the Russians are fighting as well.
So now that we get to the onset of winter, what does that portend? Is it just going to stay like it is, or do you think there will still be an offensive going on, maybe in either direction? Where do you see that?
Well, President Zelensky has said that he doesn't want to slow the fighting down over the winter. I think the reality of some of the conditions on the ground, particularly in these shoulder seasons when you do have mud before the ground hardens again, will naturally decrease the intensity of some of the fighting. But I think a lot of the decline in intensity will be driven by the fact that Ukraine is exhausted with this offensive, and they have burnt through a lot of the Western equipment that we have provided. In the run-up to the offensive, there was a massive influx and accumulation of a lot of equipment, ammunition, air defenses, things that Ukraine needed. And over these 5 months, they've burned through quite a lot of that. Of course, the Allies continue to send things in, ammunition, air defenses. There's been lots of recent announcements, including from the United States, to try to sustain some of that support, but they have burned through the mountain of steel that the United States had given. So there will be some decrease in the intensity of attacks on the Ukrainian side. And I think some of the concern is then watching what's happening on the Russian side. As I mentioned, around Avdiivka and in parts of Donetsk, there has been an uptick in the intensity of Russian attacks. They have made very little progress and they have incurred very heavy losses. But the concern is that if they were to apply more manpower into some of these fights, that the initiative in this war could flip over this autumn and into the winter, where it's been Ukraine that's been on the offensive and Russia in a much more defensive position. The concern is that that momentum could start to shift around parts of the front line.
So, Andrea, we talked about the fighting. Can you describe what that looks like for soldiers on both sides? I mean, looking at some of the reports, the casualties for both sides have been huge, especially for Ukraine, I think, right? And so what does it look like from a soldier's perspective?
Well, I think, again, it's intense and it's attritional, and it continues to be painstaking. So you'll see Ukraine will advance by a few kilometers only to be pushed back again, and vice versa. The heavily entrenched Russian position, the landmines and other things have also, created an environment where it's very difficult for Ukraine to penetrate. And I think it's worth highlighting the technology that's at play here, because that has really shaped, I think, the character of this war. I just read a really interesting Economist article that interviewed Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief, General Zaluzhny. And he underscored how technology is bringing about this deadlock. So you have these modern sensors all across the front lines that can basically detect and identify any concentration of forces. And then they're able to use this more modern precision, these modern precision weapons to then destroy it. And so both sides, as you said, are taking very heavy losses. I actually think it's the Russian side that has taken more casualties. I guess if you step back, when we talk about casualties, so both deaths and injuries on the battlefield were well over 500,000 if you add up both the Russian and the Ukrainian sides. So it really has taken a very heavy toll on both sides. The number of losses, Ukraine estimates at least that Russia has suffered 150,000 deaths. And that has been part of Ukraine's strategy, is to try to attrit the Russian military to make it harder for them to continue to prosecute the war. That might have been one of the faulty assumptions that we've talked about. Maybe there were, you wondered what had happened and why we had these inflated expectations. I think there was some belief that if you could continue to force Russia to incur these heavy losses, that at some point Putin might be more willing to get to the negotiating table or to get to the negotiating table. And that's part of the problem. In these personalist dictators, we've seen that Putin has been more than willing to accept these heavy losses. It's in part because a lot of the people that Russia has lost have been either prisoners or soldiers and fighters from Russia's poorest regions. And then that view, I think some Russians would view those lives as more expendable. But certainly from Putin's perspective, and this is what we see with personalist dictators, they actually are extremely immune to casualties in war because they turn out to be exceptionally good at diverting the losses away from the most politically important constituents whose support they need to maintain. And that's really what we've seen on the Russian side. Putin has drawn disproportionately from prisons and these poorer regions in Russia. And in that sense, I think has been largely immune to any sort of domestic pressure that might mount in the face of such heavy casualties.
So can you just contrast that now with the Ukrainian army?
There's a lot less insight that we have into their casualties, but when you look at some of the U.S. estimates, it's well over 100,000 casualties. And that is going to be a major limit. I mean, obviously, Ukraine's population is far smaller than Russia. And I think, we talk about the fact that this war could go on for a very long time. I'm fond of using the statistic that once a war goes more than 1 year, it tends to last 10 years. And then I'm quickly reminded by my Ukrainian colleagues that Ukraine can't fight this war for 10 years. And they have taken heavy losses. And so that's something, the manpower issue is something that I know is on the top of the mind of Ukraine's warfighters. It was part of the interview that I mentioned with the commander-in-chief from Ukraine. They can't fight forever because they are incurring these heavy losses.
So Andrea, let's sort of zoom out for a second and let's talk about the leaders. How would you characterize the mindsets today of President Zelensky and then Vladimir Putin?
I think dug in for both leaders, and we don't see any significant change in their approach to the war or their willingness to engage in any kind of negotiations. I think for President Zelensky, he still continues to see, rightly, this war as existential for Ukraine. There was a quote that policymakers were fond of saying at the beginning of the war, if Russia stops fighting, the war ends. If Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine ends. And that might be a little bit dramatic, but I think it captures very much the position and the mindset of Zelensky. And if you think about it, I mean, in political science terms, Zelensky faces what we would call a commitment problem, which is he can't be sure that President Putin won't merely agree to a settlement today, only to use that time to regroup, reconstitute, and then attack again tomorrow. So he remains intent on figuring out a way to expel Russian forces from his territory and win this war on the battlefield. I think, again, on Putin's side, there's no indication that he has any interest in negotiations. First and foremost, he believes that he can wait the West out. And I'm sure we'll get to this, but he's looking at what's happening here in the United States, in the U.S. Congress, the potential election of former President Trump. He looks at what's happening in Europe. You just had the election in Slovakia of a very pro-Russian candidate who agreed not to send any more support to Ukraine. You have the rise of a far-right party in Germany, the AfD. And then there's the Israel-Hamas war. And so I think in many ways, President Putin wouldn't be wrong to believe that he could wait the West out, that he's waiting for these political changes in Western capitals that will lead to the provision of less aid. That's obvious. But I also think there's a deeper issue on President Putin's side. And that is, I think it is in Putin's personal interest for this war to continue. And I say that based on a lot of research on the relationship between war termination and the impact of wars on leaders. And we know basically that so long as an autocrat is fighting a war, they're almost never ousted. Because a war does things to shut down the channels of contestation from the public, from the military. It basically makes leaders more secure in office. And the same is not true for autocrats who lose wars. They actually face an increased chance of being ousted from office. So if you're President Putin and you're worried about anything that could look like a defeat, it's in his personal interest to keep fighting so that he isn't ousted from power.
So you bring up an interesting point here, and so let's just talk briefly here about the politics in each of these countries. Is there any meaningful opposition in Ukraine to President Zelensky's management of the war? We know Ukraine, you just sort of said Ukraine can't just sustain this forever. We know that Ukraine's economy has taken a massive hit since the invasion, losing somewhere in the vicinity of 30% of its GDP. What's going on there?
Well, I still think that the politics hasn't fully returned, or in my sense is that it hasn't returned in any meaningful way. I just did, or a couple of months ago, I was in a small group discussion with Ukraine's former president, Petro Poroshenko. He was the president from 2014 to 2019. And he went to great lengths to emphasize that leaders there are adamant about presenting a united front to the enemy. And you have to remember, again, Ukraine is also under martial law because of the war, so there isn't really a free press that would enable any significant political debate. So the country is really fighting for its existence, and so politics have largely been set aside. The economy continues to be a significant problem. Yes, the fighting is happening on the battlefield, but Russia is also intent on crippling Ukraine's economy in an effort to try to compel them to end the war. So you have these relentless strikes on Ukrainian port infrastructure, its grain infrastructure. Russia pulled out of the Black Sea grain deal. So they are using every lever available to try to compel Ukraine to end the war. And it is taking a toll on Ukraine's economy. As you said, it's shrunk by something like a third. So that is an issue. There are some bright spots. I just saw that the IMF had actually increased its outlook for Ukraine's economy as people are getting and adjusting to managing an economy on wartime footing. But I think we have to be clear that Russia is intent on destroying every element of Ukraine, including its economy.
I guess the second part, we might all know it intuitively, but probably worth asking. Where does Vladimir Putin stand politically at home? Is there any meaningful change there?
Well, we shouldn't forget that we saw a challenge to his rule over the summer with the failed mutiny by Yevgeny Prigozhin, the former Wagner head. That was really a big surprise to many of us who watch the Russian political system closely. It wasn't a surprise in the sense that you couldn't see the underlying factors that would make that kind of challenge more likely, right? There was a lot of criticism of Russia's military from Prigozhin. And so you could see the tension building in the system. But again, for someone who's watched this for a long time, both the timing of Prigozhin's challenge and the brazenness of the actions that he carried out, I think were in many ways surprising. So, but since then, I mean, obviously Putin, I think it's fair to say that Putin killed Prigozhin in the plane crash. And so that was a very chilling reminder to others within the political system that if you're going to challenge the czar, you better not fail because you'll encounter a similarly nasty demise. The one thing I would say, though, I think is if you asked me this question a year or so ago, I would have told you really confidently that I think Putin will remain in office until he dies of natural causes. That's actually the fate of most longtime leaders. When I've looked at the data on all these longtime autocrats, and in most cases, once you've stayed in power for 20 years, you're likely to make it to the end. My view has since changed, and it seems to me that Putin, has this highly concentrated political system, and that given the stress and the strain of everything that's happening, it's slowly coming unwound. And some evidence of this is you see things like Putin allows now regional governors to raise their own private military companies because I think he's worried about unrest in the regions. His National Guard, the Rosgvardia, he now allows to access heavy weapons. And so you can see some of this diffusion of power out from the center into the regions. And to me, I think it's still a low probability kind of outcome. But I think there's a greater risk now that that Russia's political system could be more unstable and chaotic than I would have predicted or anticipated just a year ago.
That's really interesting. Of the military equipment that Ukraine receives, what's most important? And do these items come from a particular source, namely the U.S.? Is that true?
Well, again, I'm not a military analyst, so I'm not very good at, I don't want to evaluate one system over another, but it is to say, we get really fixated on this system or that system, and why haven't we given this to the Ukrainians? So things like the ATACMS, which they now have a lot of debate over the F-16s. But when you look at what Ukraine needs, it is a lot of the basic stuff. Ammunition is a big thing. Air defenses is really important. And I think disproportionately, they get most of their stuff from the United States. The United States is certainly Ukraine's most significant backer. That said, we have to recognize that Europe is also playing a major role. The EU itself has given more than $10 billion worth of support. They have this pledge to give Ukraine 1 million rounds of ammunition. European countries themselves have been clearing out their stocks and sending critical support to Ukraine. So yes, the United States really has done a lot, but our European allies are also doing quite a lot to help Ukraine.
So, Andrea, at the beginning, there was a little bit of a characterization of a digitally enabled army, Ukraine, fighting an analog army, Russia. Has that shifted, or what? Maybe it wasn't correct even in the beginning, but what do you think about that?
Well, it's certainly true that now Ukraine has the backing of these much more technologically advanced systems. But I think what we're seeing on the battlefield is just how relevant things like landmines and trenches and all of these other things are. So I think that the challenge is understanding how Ukraine is able to put to good use these advanced technological systems when Russia can continue to resort to incredibly crude attacks on civilian centers, knocking out critical infrastructure like the electricity grid. So it's not always clear exactly how these things match up. But both countries are very much in a technological race. On the drone front, it's something that I don't know all that much about, but there's a whole lot happening in terms of drones and their ability to integrate AI to identify targets, et cetera. So there is also a lot happening on the technological side, with Russia and Ukraine kind of racing to figure out who can gain that technological edge in this competition.
We're going to take a quick break now, and we'll be right back with more of our discussion with Andrea Kendall-Taylor.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
So, Andrea, I asked these last few questions because I'm curious about U.S. support going forward. And as you mentioned, there's opposition in Congress. You have a presidential election next year, and what appears imposed to be some uncertainty among the American public about aid to Ukraine. In fact, I saw a couple weeks ago that the Biden administration saw it necessary to start arguing that the provision of U.S. weapon systems was good for U.S. jobs. So, with all that as a backdrop, how important is continued U.S. support? I think you sort of touched on it, but
yeah, it really is essential, and there's no way around it. Yes, our European allies have done quite a lot, but if the United States pulled out of that space, or if our support declined significantly, Europe would have a really hard time filling up and making up that gap. We have a problem with our defense industrial base here in the United States, and that problem is even greater in Europe. So it would be significantly challenging for them, especially in the near term, to step in and fulfill. So our U.S. support is really critical. I think it's critical because not just in terms of who would make it up, but also the signals that it sends to our adversaries who are watching. If we walk away from our commitment to stay with Ukraine, quote unquote, as long as it takes, then I think it further discredits the United States on the global stage, and it will show that we don't follow through with our pledges. And I think it shows other adversaries like China that you can just wait us out, that our support, that we will tire over time. Our declining support would also leave Ukraine in a dire predicament, and that would create conditions in which Russia could make additional progress on the battlefield. And that would basically mean that the United States and Europe would find ourselves in this position again in the future, which would also cost us a lot more in the long term. I think it's important also just to remind listeners that the United States is spending just 2% of our defense budget on Ukraine. And in my view, that's an extremely reasonable and modest investment to be making in our security over the long term.
So, Andrea, we just talked about some of the challenges here in the U.S. for continued support. Similarly, in Europe, I know it's not a monolith, but or is it? Or do you see the support there stronger?
I think the support is holding more significantly than it is here in the United States. I mean, I mentioned a couple of problematic developments, the election in Slovakia that brought in a pro-Russian leader, the rise of the AfD in Germany. But Europe feels this war in a very different way. You know, if you're Poland, if you're the Baltics, this really is an existential fight, because the concern there is that if Russia is successful in Ukraine, that their countries very well could be next. And so there is much more staunch support. The thing that I worry the most about is, even if you have the political support, the state of Western defense industrial bases is such that we might not be able to produce what Ukraine needs as quickly as they need it. And that is definitely the case, you know, here in the United States. As I said earlier, Ukraine really has burned through the mountain of metal that the United States has given. We are doing our best to continue to provide ammunition, air defenses, the things that Ukraine burns through most quickly. But for a lot of the weapon systems that Ukraine needs, we've had to put on order these systems, and those orders won't be fulfilled for 12 to 14 months. And so if you're really looking at what might happen in Ukraine, I think it is a story where next year Ukraine isn't going to have the critical accumulation of weapons that they would need to wage another major offensive. So for 2024, Ukraine is likely going to have to just hold its positions until orders and deliveries come through for 2025, when they could make a more significant push.
So, Andrea, at the top of the podcast, we mentioned the Middle East. How do you think about the impact of the crisis in the Middle East on U.S. support to Ukraine?
I think immediately it hasn't had that much of an impact in terms of stuff, in terms of what we're able to give Ukraine. And even since the conflict in the Middle East, the United States has come forward with additional support drawing from the presidential's drawdown authority. We've seen a whole bunch of announcements in Europe in terms of new tranches of support for Ukraine. So most immediately, I don't think it directly impacts what we're able to provide Ukraine. The big concern is if the war in the Middle East continues for a long time, and especially if it widens. Then the United States, I think, would find itself lacking the capacity, the capability to be able to materially support both conflicts at the same time. So that's really the big concern. And I think the broader point I would make is, the more that I look back at Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the more to me it looks like a really critical turning point, in the sense that the global order, the US-led order that the United States so benefits from, has been under strain for a very long time. My concern is that the invasion of Ukraine has more fully discredited that order, that it's given new life to this illiberal axis. We see Russia doubling down on its relationships with China, Iran, North Korea, and that when you live in a global system where you have two competing orders, if you look at the international relations theory, it shows that those are times where interstate conflicts tend to increase. And so the big question is, are we in a new reality where you have an emboldened illiberal coalition of actors who are more intent on challenging the United States and the order that we live in, where we will see the return of regional conflicts that we haven't seen for so many years? And in that world, having multiple conflicts and crises, the United States is not prepared to be able to resource all of these conflicts. And that's what I worry about.
Okay, Andrea, we've covered a lot, but I guess I'll probably have to ask you some of the big sort of crystal ball kind of questions here. So what do you think would have to change to have both sides be seriously interested in a ceasefire?
It's really hard to see that what that one thing would be. I think from Ukraine's perspective, or at least meaning Ukraine's perspective of getting Russia to the table, it's been my view that Ukraine would have to seriously threaten to hold Crimea at risk. So for Putin, I think his worst case scenario is an outcome in which he loses Crimea. That's something that he's staked his own personal reputation on, his legitimacy as a leader. And so until Ukraine can credibly threaten to hold Crimea at risk, it is extremely difficult for me to see Vladimir Putin coming to the table. I don't know what it would be on Ukraine's side. I worry a lot that it's just time, that they'll get to the point where they find it difficult to be able to sustain this conflict. But if we get to that world, then I think it means that Ukraine has lost. And so time really is of the essence. And in a best case scenario, then my hope is that Western support, US support will continue all through 2024, that we can get another influx of the weapons that Ukraine needs for them to make another major push in 2025. And I think that's been the US position really from the beginning, is that we have to help Ukraine on the battlefield so that they're in the best possible position at the negotiating table. But that doesn't look like it will happen next year to me. And so the support has to continue, and we have to help Ukraine wage another major offensive that would really threaten key things that Putin talks about, and maybe then we could have more serious negotiations.
So just to put another, or look at this from another angle, what do you think winning means for each side? What do you think it means for Ukraine? Maybe that's obvious. What do you think it means for Russia?
Yep. Ukraine's position hasn't changed from the beginning. And Zelensky continues to say that it will be the restoration of Ukraine's territorial sovereignty. So expelling all Russian forces from Ukrainian territory, plus wartime reparations and accountability for war crimes. That continues to be his more maximalist definition of what victory looks like. On the Russian side, it's a lot more amorphous. Putin has gone to great lengths to not define what winning looks like, in large part because I think it will give him the flexibility to navigate his way out of the conflict. I mean, for him, I think at this point, it is more immediately focused on gaining control over the territories in Ukraine that he has illegally annexed. But we should also be clear that Putin hasn't changed his overall objective in this war, which really is the capitulation of the Ukrainian state, full Russian control, having a more compliant regime change in Kyiv, such that you have a more compliant Ukraine on Russia's borders. So they're both, in my view, and again, it comes back to the mindset of the leaders that you asked earlier, they're both still in these very maximalist positions, and it's unlikely that this ends in any, neither side is going to achieve this outright maximalist definition of victory.
So lots of possibilities and variables, but if I had to pin you down for a guess as to when this ends, what would you say?
I don't know. I think, again, my sense is that this will continue for several more years at least. If the United States and Europe can continue to provide Ukraine with the weapons that it needs, Ukraine will be in a much better position to get Russia to the negotiating table. So that's, I think, that's one scenario, is that Ukraine can go to the negotiating table from a position of strength so long as they have another major push of Western support. I think a less acceptable scenario is one where you see a decline in Western support such that Russia is able to make more gains. And so it's really, again, there's so many different scenarios, so many different variables. It's still really difficult to know how this ends, but it does not feel close. And my best assessment is that we will still be watching this war and supporting this war for several more years to come.
So, Andrea, you touched on something just a few moments ago. Maybe it's a good point to end on, and that's you stated your view about why this war is important to the United States. Could you just sort of summarize that for our listeners, like what, because it's broader than just Russia, Ukraine?
Oh, it definitely is. I think first and foremost, it has really direct security implications for the United States, because I believe very strongly that if Putin is successful in Ukraine, that he will continue to push his objectives to include countries potentially like the Baltic countries or Poland. We've seen over time that Putin has a growing appetite for risk-taking. You know, all of this began in 2008 in Georgia when he invaded the country. Then the 2014 invasion of Ukraine, the insertion of Russian forces into Syria in 2015, the meddling in our election here in 2016. So Putin has a clear track record of when he faces little pushback, he continues to act more aggressively. So I feel confident that if we aren't successful, if Ukraine is not successful in defeating Russia, that he won't stop there, and that it will pose ever greater challenges to our NATO allies, who we have, through Article 5, an obligation to protect. So I do think in many ways there is a direct national security implication, because if Putin is not defeated in Ukraine, the United States could be drawn into a conflict with a nuclear-powered state somewhere down the line. And I think your point is a really important one. Yes, this war is about Ukraine, but Putin really sees himself as being at war with the West. And he will keep pushing because he's intent on destroying this international order. So it's critical for the United States to step up and push back, because it comes back to the point I made before, that we are living now in a world where Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, all of these actors are intent on destroying the rules that govern the world that we live in. And if you have an emboldened set of actors who are successful in pushing their revisionist aims, the rules for the United States, the rules of the world will look quite different. And it could very well be that several years down the line, if these emboldened authoritarian actors are effective, that we will find ourselves living in a very different world, and one in which I don't think Americans would appreciate.
Very sobering. Andrea, thank you very much for the fantastic insights and for joining us today at Intelligence Matters.
Thank you for having me.
That was Andrea Kendall-Taylor. I'm Andy McCreadis. Please join us next week for another episode of Intelligence Matters.
Intelligence Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry and Sophia Rubin. Intelligence Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.